Welcome to my channel. I never planned to share this story, but I feel like there's an important lesson here that could help someone else. This is the story of a turning point in my marriage, something unexpected yet profoundly life-changing. While it's personal, I believe it's worth sharing because of the lessons I learned along the way. Help this channel grow by liking, subscribing, and leaving a comment. Your support means the world. Let's get into it. I never thought something so unexpected could shake the foundation of my marriage. But when my husband walked in on me with our horse, everything changed. And I'm about to tell you how that one moment led us to confront everything we thought we knew about trust, love, and forgiveness. It sounds almost absurd, doesn't it? A horse inside the house, no less. But this wasn't some careless mistake. This moment wasn't about the horse, not really. It was about everything that had been brewing beneath the surface of our marriage, the quiet resentments, the words left unsaid, the growing distance between us that neither of us dared to address. You see, it wasn't the horse itself that caught him off guard. It was what that moment represented. We had been drifting apart for so long, living in the same space but rarely seeing each other. Chris was buried in his work. I was left to pick up the pieces of everything else. It had been like that for months, perhaps even longer. Our conversations had become mechanical, our affection minimal, but we kept telling ourselves that everything was fine. That night, though, I couldn't keep up the pretense any longer. I needed something, anything. I needed to feel alive, to feel real again. So, in a moment of desperation, I led the horse inside. I had no intention of doing anything outrageous, just a desperate attempt to break the silence. But what I didn't know was that the silence was what had been killing us. I thought that if I could just shake things up, break out of the routine, I'd find a way to reconnect. When I heard the front door creak open, I wasn't even aware of how much time had passed. I didn't realize Chris had come home early, or that he'd be walking in on me in the most absurd of circumstances. But then I heard him, standing in the doorway, his voice barely above a whisper. "What are you doing?" The words hung in the air, sharp and foreign, as though they didn't belong in our lives. I turned slowly, my heart pounding in my chest, to find him standing there, frozen. His face was pale, his expression a mixture of confusion and something I couldn't place. In that moment, everything, the years of accumulated tension, the half-hearted attempts to reconnect, came crashing down around us. I had expected anger, frustration, maybe even disbelief, but what I saw on Chris's face wasn't any of that. It was something deeper. It was like he had seen a version of me that he didn't know existed. Something beyond the surface, beyond the woman I had tried to be for him. And the worst part was that I couldn't explain it. How could I explain the emptiness I'd been feeling? How could I put into words the frustration of living in a house that no longer felt like a home? I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what he needed to hear. The silence between us stretched on for what felt like an eternity. until finally he spoke again, his voice tight, his gaze never leaving me. "Why the horse?" His words were simple, but the way they hung in the air between us made it clear. He wasn't just asking about the horse. He was asking about everything. And that's when I realized it wasn't about the horse. It was about everything we hadn't said, everything we hadn't dealt with, the hurt, the neglect, the absence of intimacy, both physical and emotional, that had been growing between us for far too long. Chris didn't walk in on me with the horse. He walked in on a truth we had both been avoiding. How could something as random as a horse expose all of this? How could an innocent moment in the middle of an otherwise ordinary evening reveal the fractures in a relationship that neither of us had been brave enough to confront? But it did. That one moment, awkward, embarrassing, and absurd as it was, cracked open something between us. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic breakdown. It wasn't about big, dramatic gestures or angry outbursts. No, it was the quiet realization that we were both failing each other in ways we hadn't acknowledged, even to each other. And there was no turning back from that. But what happens after the moment of realization? How do you rebuild from something that feels irreparably broken? How far do you go to repair the damage when you realize you've been living a lie for far too long? I can't say the answers came easily. In fact, they didn't come at all. What followed was a slow, painful process. But this wasn't the end of our story. No, this was just the beginning. And you'll see how we began the long, messy, uncertain path toward healing. But first, you need to understand something. Healing doesn't come easily, and it doesn't always look the way you expect it to. Sometimes it comes in the form of a horse, in the form of a conversation that doesn't even feel like a conversation at all. Sometimes it takes something completely out of the blue to finally make you realize what you've been missing all along. Stay with me, and I'll show you how this unexpected moment brought everything we thought we knew about love and trust into sharp focus, and how, against all odds, we tried to rebuild it from the ground up. Our marriage seemed perfect from the outside. People looked at us and saw a couple who had it all. The laughter, the love, the little moments of togetherness that make a marriage appear unshakable. We had our routines. Shared meals, quiet nights on the couch, the occasional weekend getaway. We knew each other's quirks, our strengths, and our weaknesses. We were the couple everyone else envied, or so it seemed. But if I'm being honest, there were things we hadn't talked about, things that were quietly building up between us, like the unspoken tension in a room that no one dares to address. It wasn't something that appeared overnight. There were no dramatic fights, no sudden revelations. It was more like a slow fade, where little by little we began to feel more like roommates than partners. I stopped feeling seen. He stopped hearing me. The love was still there, but the closeness, the intimacy, the connection, It had slipped through our fingers almost without either of us realizing it. We both had our distractions. I had my work, my daily routines, the house, the kids. Chris, too, had his own world, wrapped up in his career, his hobbies, and his responsibilities. There was always something else pulling us in different directions, and for a long time, neither of us questioned it. We went through the motions because we thought that's what we were supposed to do. But in the quiet corners of my mind, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. It wasn't something we ever talked about, and maybe that was part of the problem. That constant assumption that it'll get better, just wait. But waiting only made things worse. You can only ignore the cracks for so long before they start to show. We were two people who had been ignoring the small, quiet distance growing between us, and we had gotten so used to it that neither of us even noticed how far apart we had drifted. There was something inside me, something I couldn't name, that told me it wasn't just the usual stress of life. No, it was deeper. Maybe it was the monotony. Maybe it was the silent resentment of things left unsaid. Or maybe it was the exhaustion of carrying all the weight of life alone, even when someone else was right there beside you. It wasn't about blame. It wasn't about pointing fingers. It was simply the way things had become, and neither of us knew how to change it. In retrospect, I realized that we had been playing a game of avoidance for months, possibly even longer, avoiding difficult conversations, avoiding the reality of where we were, and most importantly, avoiding the truth of what we were becoming. We'd forgotten how to talk to each other, not just about the big things, but the small things too, the things that used to matter, the things that used to make us us. It wasn't until that one moment, the moment that caught us both off guard, that I finally understood how far we had come. I wasn't ready for it. I wasn't prepared to confront everything that had been simmering under the surface. And yet, in the most unexpected way, it forced me to face the raw truth. How do you fix something when you don't even know where to begin? When you've spent so much time ignoring the issues that now they seem insurmountable? And worse, what happens when you realize that the person you thought you knew, the person you've spent your whole life with, might not be who you thought they were after all? That day, when Chris walked into that room, I had no idea what was coming. I didn't realize that this small, seemingly insignificant moment would be the catalyst for everything we were about to go through. How could I have known that a simple misunderstanding would pull back the curtain on everything that had been silently eroding our marriage? The horse was just the catalyst. The issue wasn't the horse at all. The issue was the truth, the realization that somehow we had become strangers to each other, and that in turn led to the harder question. How far had we fallen, and how much of ourselves were we willing to give up in order to salvage something we thought we had lost? You might be asking yourself, how did we get here? How did a couple who once seemed inseparable end up in a place where we could barely even talk to each other? That's a question I asked myself over and over after that night. It wasn't easy to look in the mirror and realize that the person I thought I knew better than anyone was a stranger to me in that moment. But it was the reality of what we had become. What happens when your love starts to feel like a memory? What happens when the affection, the understanding, the trust begins to fray at the edges and you don't even know where to begin to stitch it all back together? Is it too late? Can you fix something that's already broken beyond recognition? Or is it just too painful to even try? And then, in the midst of all this confusion and uncertainty, something simple and raw happened. A moment of clarity, if you will. I remember sitting there in the quiet aftermath, asking myself the most terrifying question of all. Do I even know what I'm looking for anymore? Would you be able to admit that you were no longer who you thought you were? Would you be able to see past your own hurt and fear to find a way back to the love you once had? Could you face the person standing next to you, knowing everything had shifted, and find the strength to move forward? These questions haunted me, and I'm sure they haunted Chris too. How could they not? What's left to do when the walls have already started to close in? And what if, just maybe, you realized that the very thing you were so afraid to confront was exactly what you needed all along? Stay with me, and I'll show you how we began to figure that out. I had always loved animals, especially horses. There was something about their calm presence that brought a kind of peace to my otherwise chaotic world. Our horse, Charlie, had become a sort of quiet refuge for me. I'd spend hours brushing him, just taking in the simplicity of his company. No demands, no complicated conversations, just silence and the steady rhythm of his breathing. That day, I needed that peace more than ever. The tension between Chris and me had been building, and I was at my breaking point. Work, responsibilities, the strain of our unspoken frustrations. It was all weighing on me. So I decided to take some time to myself, just me and Charlie. I didn't want to think about anything. I wasn't looking for answers. I just needed a moment to breathe, to remember what it felt like to be calm and free from the constant hum of life that seemed to be closing in on me. The idea of spending time with the horse wasn't about escape in a reckless way. It wasn't a form of avoidance, not in the way you might think. It was about reconnecting with something simple, something real, something that didn't have strings attached. It was just me, the horse, and the quiet afternoon. But as I stood there in the barn, brushing the horse's coat, a kind of serenity settled over me. It felt like I was shedding a layer of the stress that had been accumulating for weeks. It wasn't supposed to be anything more than a moment of personal peace, but the universe had other plans. Just as I was starting to relax into the rhythm of the afternoon, the door to the barn creaked open. At first, I didn't even notice. It was only when I heard the soft sound of footsteps that I looked up. There he was, Chris, standing in the doorway. For a moment, time seemed to stop. His eyes locked on me, and then to my horror, they moved to the horse standing by my side. His expression was unreadable. It wasn't just the sight of me with the horse that caught him off guard. It was the timing, the suddenness of it all. It felt like everything that had been building up between us, all the tension, all the quiet discomfort exploded in that instant. I didn't know what to say. I froze. I could see it in his eyes. The hurt, the confusion, the disorientation. He didn't understand why I was there, why I was spending time with the horse instead of with him. I didn't understand either. In that split second, everything about our relationship that we'd been avoiding rushed to the surface. It wasn't about the horse. The horse was just a symbol, a way for me to find some peace. But in Chris's eyes, it felt like a betrayal, like I had chosen to be with the animal over him. He didn't understand the need for that quiet moment. He didn't understand why, in that moment, I needed something more than what we had together. And that's when it hit me. We had both been hiding things, hiding parts of ourselves from each other. I had been keeping my emotions in check, pretending like everything was fine when it wasn't. And he had been doing the same. The more I looked at him, the more I realized how much we had been avoiding. We weren't just two people who had grown apart over time. We were two people who hadn't even tried to understand each other anymore. We had both been looking for something, but neither of us had been brave enough to ask for it. Chris stood there, silent, still processing what he had walked in on. The air between us was thick with unspoken words, a weight that neither of us knew how to lift. I could feel the sharp sting of guilt creeping in, but more than that, I felt exposed in a way that was difficult to describe. It wasn't the horse that was causing the discomfort. It was the vulnerability, the rawness of the situation. For the first time in a long time, we were both seeing each other clearly, and neither of us liked what we saw. He finally spoke, his voice low, filled with disbelief. What's going on? It? It wasn't a question about the horse. Not really. It was a question about everything we hadn't talked about, everything we had kept buried for so long. I could hear the pain in his voice, the sting of betrayal. But it wasn't the betrayal I had feared. It was the realization that we had been drifting apart, and neither of us had known how to stop it. I don't know, I whispered, my own voice barely audible. I just needed some space, some time to think. I didn't know how to explain what I had been feeling, what I had been avoiding. How could I? We hadn't had an honest conversation in months. How could I expect him to understand? Oh, the silence that followed was deafening. I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on me, and I could see it in his face. He wasn't angry, not yet, but there was hurt, deep, unmistakable hurt. It wasn't just about the horse. It was about everything we hadn't said, everything we hadn't shared. The tension in the air was so thick, I could almost taste it. And in that moment, I realized how fragile everything we had was. This wasn't just an awkward misunderstanding. It was a reflection of something much deeper, something we had both been too afraid to face. And what made it worse was that we didn't know where to go from here. Could we fix this? Could we fix what had been slowly breaking for so long? And yet, despite all of this, the hurt, the confusion, the silence, I knew we had to face it. We couldn't keep running from the truth. But in that moment, in that barn, I wasn't sure if we could ever find our way back. In the aftermath of that moment, I kept trying to convince myself that it was no big deal. I told myself I could just move past it, that we would both get over it, and pretend it hadn't happened. But the truth was, I couldn't. I couldn't shake off the weight of the shame that hung over me. It wasn't about the horse. No, that wasn't the problem at all. The horse had been a source of calm for me, a quiet refuge from everything else that had been happening. It wasn't even about the act of spending time with him. It was about what that moment represented. It was about my need to escape, my desire to disconnect from everything that had been slowly unraveling in our relationship. My husband didn't see it that way. For him, it wasn't just about me spending time with the horse. It was about the fact that I had turned to something outside of our relationship, something that felt like a betrayal. And I couldn't blame him for that, because in many ways, he was right. I had been avoiding the real issues between us. I had been pretending that everything was fine when it wasn't. And in that split second, he saw me for what I had become, someone who was trying to hide from our problems rather than confront them. I could still see his face when he walked into that barn. The hurt and confusion were clear in his eyes, but so was the disappointment. He didn't understand why I was so distant, why I had pulled away in the way I had, and honestly, neither did I. How had we gotten here? How had we reached this point where something so simple, something so seemingly innocent, could cause such a huge rift between us? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that we hadn't been truly honest with each other for a long time. We hadn't addressed the things that had been slowly eroding the trust between us. Work, stress, life, these were the things we'd allowed to push us further apart. But there was something deeper, something more unspoken that we had both been avoiding. The horse wasn't the issue. The issue was that we hadn't known how to talk to each other anymore. We hadn't known how to fix what was broken between us. That evening, after everything had settled down, we had a long conversation, if you could even call it that. It wasn't a conversation in the traditional sense. It was more of an explosion of emotions. Angry words were spoken. We both said things we didn't mean, things we hadn't even realized we felt until that moment. But once the floodgates opened, it was like we couldn't stop. We talked about everything, the things we had been too scared to say before, the frustrations we had buried so deep inside. It was messy, painful, and raw. And in that moment, it felt like everything we had built together was slipping through our fingers. It wasn't just about the horse anymore. It was about all the small things that had accumulated over time, the moments of silence, the lack of communication, the growing distance between us. All of it came rushing forward, and it was overwhelming. I wanted to fix it. I wanted to make everything better. But the more we talked, the more I realized how much work it would take to heal the wounds we had inflicted on each other. Could we fix this? Could we ever get back to what we had? Or had we already crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed? And yet, despite everything, a small part of me held on to the hope that maybe, just maybe, this could be the turning point. Maybe this raw confrontation, this painful moment, would be the catalyst for us to face the truth, to finally talk about what we had been avoiding for so long. But at that moment, all I could do was sit there, unsure of where we went from here, unsure of how we would ever rebuild what had been broken. After everything had erupted, after the anger and hurt had simmered down, something unexpected began to take shape. We started to talk, really talk. For the first time in what felt like years, we were forced to face the reality of what had been festering between us. It wasn't easy. There were no quick fixes, no magic words that could suddenly heal the wound we had both caused. But slowly, we started rebuilding not just the relationship, but the foundation of trust that had been crumbling for so long. At first, it felt awkward. Those early conversations were clumsy, stumbling over our emotions, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. But as the days passed, something started to shift. We began to see each other not just as husband and wife, but as two people who had been hurt, who had been lost in their own ways. We talked about the things we had been avoiding, the work stress, the misunderstandings, the distance. And yes, we even talked about the horse. It wasn't just an elephant in the room anymore. It was a symbol of everything we had ignored, everything we had failed to address. And somehow, by talking about it, we started to untangle the bigger issues. There were tears, I won't lie. There were many moments of raw, uncomfortable vulnerability. But there were also moments of clarity. We began to realize that our obsession with maintaining the perfect image of our marriage had kept us from actually communicating. We had spent so much time trying to be the couple everyone thought we were that we forgot to be honest with each other. We had neglected the small but important things, the simple check-ins, the gentle acts of care, the need to express our feelings before they boiled over into something uncontrollable. It wasn't an overnight fix. In fact, it took time, weeks, months. But with each conversation, each moment of patience, we started to rebuild. We learned to listen. We learned to ask the right questions, not just to solve problems, but to understand each other's hearts. We learned that healing didn't just mean fixing what was broken. It meant growing together. And sometimes that growth meant admitting where we had failed and being vulnerable enough to start again. The horse, strangely enough, became part of the process. It wasn't the reason for everything falling apart, but it was a part of how we healed. It was where we began to talk, where we started to confront our own inner struggles. It was in those quiet moments with the horse that we realized how much we had been missing in our connection. It wasn't just about me escaping with the horse. It was about me realizing that I had been avoiding the real conversations with my husband, the ones that could have saved us from so much pain. But now, with time and effort, I began to rebuild my relationship with him in a way that was grounded in honesty and vulnerability. I think what we both learned in the end was that a marriage, any relationship, can't survive if both people are too afraid to face the truth. The truth isn't always easy. It's messy, sometimes painful, and often uncomfortable. But the truth, once faced, becomes a bridge that leads to deeper understanding. And in our case, that truth was the beginning of something new. I think we had a shared understanding. The more people we loved, the stronger. Looking back, I don't regret the chaos, the moments of confusion, the pain, the fallout. They all led us to this place, to a place where we could finally rebuild together. It wasn't just about us fixing what had been broken. It was about learning what we needed to do to prevent it from happening again. And while the road hasn't always been easy, I can honestly say that we've been broken again. It was fulfilled in a way that we never could have foreseen. Stronger, more connected, and more aware of the work it takes to maintain the trust and love that we now know we can't take for granted. And as for the horse, he's still a part of our lives, a gentle reminder of where we've been and how far we've come, a symbol of the quiet healing that sometimes comes in unexpected places. The most important lesson I took away from all of this is simple yet powerful. If you're avoiding the tough conversations, thinking they're too painful to face, you're only setting yourself up for bigger problems down the road. Silence doesn't heal, it just festers. I'm not saying it's easy. In fact, it can be incredibly uncomfortable. But the longer we put off those difficult talks, the more they grow into something unmanageable, something that can tear apart everything we've worked for. If you're in a relationship where things feel off, if you're sensing that the communication is breaking down, take a step back and ask yourself, what am I avoiding? What's left unsaid that could be silently eroding the trust and connection between you? When we were at our lowest, I realized that everything had spiraled because we hadn't talked. I can't emphasize enough how much communication can either make or break a relationship. Yes, it can be awkward and messy, but if you don't say it out loud, the silence will speak for you. And trust me, it doesn't speak kindly. So speak up, share your thoughts, your fears, your frustrations, even if it's tough. Rebuilding trust after it's been shaken takes time, but it's possible. It's about creating a space where you both can be vulnerable, where you don't just talk about the issues, but you listen to each other. Sometimes it takes admitting that you don't have all the answers and that you need help. No one has it figured out, and it's okay to say, I'm struggling. That's where healing begins. The road won't always be smooth, but honesty will be your guide, and it will lead you to a deeper, more real connection. I want you to think about your own relationships. Have you ever been in a situation where something was left unsaid, only for it to come back and bite you later? How did you handle it? Or maybe you're in the middle of something like this right now, feeling stuck, unsure how to move forward. I'd really love to hear your stories and thoughts, so drop a comment below and share how you deal with conflict in your own relationships or how you've worked to rebuild trust. We're all in this together, and sometimes just hearing someone else's experience can make a world of difference. Looking back, I can say that day changed us in ways I never expected. It wasn't an easy road, and it certainly wasn't something we could just brush under the rug. But in the end, we came out the other side, stronger. Our relationship is in a better place now. Different, yes, but stronger. We learned the hard way that trust isn't something you can take for granted. It's not a one-time thing. It's something you have to nurture, something you have to work on every single day. It's in the small moments, the conversations, and the shared vulnerabilities that we find what holds us together. I'll never forget that afternoon with the horse. It became a turning point, a lesson I carry with me every day. It reminded me that the most important things in life are often the hardest to face. But when we do, we come out with a better understanding of who we are and what we truly need from the ones we love. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been through something similar or learned a lesson from a difficult moment, I encourage you to like, comment, and share your thoughts. What's your experience with rebuilding trust or overcoming challenges in your relationships? Let's keep this conversation going. And don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Thank you for being here and for sharing this journey with me.